and
we can play it.
People can then look at it then. And may I then shift to our panellists? And shall we go in the same order as before? Peter and then Lynn.
Great, thank you, Chris. And thanks, Desmond and Lucia. Just to be clear, that unlike Liesbet and Desmond and GC, I'm not funded by the Hewlett Foundation. Lynn, I'll give you my bank account details. I couldn't turn it down. Okay, I'm going to dive in the detail. I think FTI, what do we think of FTI UK? Not least of all because we've invested quite a bit of energy and political and financial resources in it. I think we think its performance has been mixed. It's done some good things. It's got some faults. We think there's good things to build on, and we think the reforms underway in terms of governance, in terms of financing and replenishment, and in terms of better delivery are good, probably not deep enough or broad enough. And we still have a challenge. Olaf and I will pick this up in the FTI board next week in terms of moving the FTI from where it is now into closer, I think, to closer in a position where it can meet the challenge that Desmond has put forward, which I think is a very helpful challenge. We do believe we need to transform the FTI, not just tinker with it, that we really need to have a bigger, better partnership looking forward. And we think, and indeed we have said so directly to the US, we want you, the US, to be part of this partnership going forward. Don't step back and look at the FTI and say, take it or leave it. We want you to be inside the tent in terms of its redesign. We think there are some immediate tasks for the FTI. Our Secretary of State, Douglas Alexander, at the World Bank annual meetings in Istanbul laid out 6 things he thinks the FTI needs to focus on immediately. 1, it needs to get more money. 2, it needs to link its replenishment to the One Goal campaign more tightly, which is a campaign we strongly support, and it also needs to link it to opportunities in the US. 3, it needs to address some of its operational inefficiencies, its big cash balance, its means of delivery, and its story on aid effectiveness. 4, it needs to deal better with fragile states. 5, it needs to have a better story and actions around equity and inclusion. And 6, it needs a better governance structure. Now, I think if we address all of those challenges, they add up to more than tinkering. So, as I said, our ambition is not to discard the FTI, but to try and shape it with the US and others inside that tent to get to the point where it can deliver better going forward and be really a more significant global education partnership. 2 other things. One Goal campaign, we're strongly behind this, the UK. We think it is just an unbelievable opportunity to capture some of that audience of billions and help leave a legacy around education in Africa. And it maps back directly to the analysis and recommendations from Liesbet's paper. If we do this right, it could be really significant. We think there's the key challenge is in translating what will be a lot of noise into what's the transmission vehicles between that and meaningful popular participation and meaningful impact on the kind of things that Lucia put down. Will it affect what politicians do, the political economy of allocating resources and delivering them better? What are the transmission vehicles to do that? Finally, we talked in the last session about what has been positive about the health sector. I think in this session it's worth laying down a very short marker about where we do a better job in education, and it's related to the architecture issues that have come out here. We all know how complicated the health architecture is. Rwanda has a per capita health spend of something like $35 per annum. That's enough to do a good job in health. The Commission of Macroeconomics in Health say that's about enough. But it's wildly misaligned with what the government needs and with any sensible allocation of resources related to burden of disease or efficiency. The Ministry of Health in Rwanda has to report against over 650 indicators in the health sector to donors alone. You can't run a system like that. We haven't got that in education. We're not going to have it, but we need to think about, as we create a new and better partnership going forward, how to take the best of what efficiencies we have currently while maximising the opportunities.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. Lynn.
Just first, a historical point. I find it striking that we are here today discussing the how of a global education compact. And those of you who were sitting around conversations about a decade ago would have remembered that the question then was whether a global compact for education. And so perhaps we just need to remind ourselves of where we actually have come. And I often think about, we've moved from a world of unilateral and bilateral to definitely multilateral and transnational, as the global campaign attests to. And then we're getting into the thorny issues of what does opening up the space look like and governance. But perhaps, again, a word on why in the world is the Hewlett Foundation funding so many of these different initiatives. And in fact, we have also been funding, some of you have heard about the cash on delivery approach and the intellectual work for that. Not necessarily to say that is the way, but to try to get more instruments out there that are looking at the outcomes. So again, I just want to say that our goal in this, we are agnostic on the mechanism for this global compact for education. And even though Gene Sperling put our name on the front page of his paper, we are certainly not calling necessarily for a global fund for education, but we definitely do want to support this debate, listening to that there is need for reform of the existing mechanism that is out there. So definitely don't want a proliferation. And while we are agnostic on what the mechanism looks like, we are very clear on what the outcome is that we'd like to see, which is more children in school that are learning. So again, that comes back to the issue of aid effectiveness, which I kind of think about a lot of this conversation being, it's kind of the way I see it. And perhaps because I'm sitting within a foundation, I'll just very briefly comment on a few of these ideas about opening up the space, who's sitting around at the table, and what do different types of actors have to contribute. It seems to me that that space needs to be opened up, both globally and also within countries. And there's a real sense, I was saying earlier, that I've been going to many of the international meetings for quite a long time, but there's still a very felt sense, a very real and felt sense, that it's a club among government agencies, whether it be an intergovernmental agency or a government themselves. It is not clear, for example, for someone like myself who is engaged in issues around aid effectiveness, and indeed we support some efforts on transparency and accountability, advocacy, it's still not clear where our involvement is. And so there's definitely a need to think differently about what does it look like for people to be sharing, whether it's just joint decision making, but who's getting invited to certain meetings and how to make their time there really valuable. And I'm not saying this just for my own self, but if we were to expand who's coming, why are they there, to put the question sharply. That also has to happen within countries. When I go to many of the countries we work in, lest you think that most of our work is at the global level. In fact, most of the work that we're funding actually is in countries in East and West Africa and also India. And let's put India aside because they're an outlier in this. But there it's really striking that the governments don't really know what to do with us. They're looking at me thinking, well, you're not USAID, you're not the World Bank, you're not Hewlett Packard, you've just corrected me, so what do I do with you? And there's not, and even I think the local donor groups are also trying to understand how actually, what to do with us. Some of you may know we've been funding some work on the early grade reading assessment or have backed some of the funding of something that was started in India called ASER, the Annual Studies of Education Report, to go on in East Africa. And in 2010, as some of the evidence comes out about what kids are and aren't learning, I think the question is going to become, who's funding this? And there's not necessarily instruments or ways that governments are thinking about better using us, and also the local donor group. You know, we go and I can make a presentation, but beyond that, really meaningful dialogue. At the same time, I don't want to go so far down the path of saying that's exactly where we want to be, because this gets to my second point is we need to take a broader view of resources. What are the kinds of different resources that different kinds of actors put on the table? And we as a foundation can often be more flexible. We can fund kind of more provocative things because we're not a government agency. We can do things in a more timely manner. We can take the front-end high-risk investment that may be not so palatable to government agencies. And that's, in fact, what we're trying to do, and fund ideas. And ideas are an important resource in and of themselves. And The last thing I would just say is to comment on this idea of, is 2010 the year of education? I think we are, of course, supporting these various efforts, and there is an incredible opportunity through the One Goal campaign. And from our own perspective, it's not just the year to get more money for education, but the year to really see that there's real change in education financing and delivery. It would be a shame if the year went and that didn't actually happen. So I'll leave it with there so you all can comment.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Lynn, and indeed Peter. We have about 20 minutes, so what I'd like to do is have a quarter of an hour's discussion from the floor and then turn to our panellists again to wind up. It's open. Yes, sir.
Patrick Quinn from the Isle of Charlie.
The microphone just coming behind you there.
Patrick Quinn from the ILO's Programme on Child Labour. Just a quick question for Desmond. Some of this upscaling of effort, acceleration of effort, is possible without the US, but a number of the speakers have referred to the significance of getting the US on board in this. And from this side, it seems the pond, we kind of get the impression a little bit that some of the enthusiasm for significant injection of new resources to education has been waning a little bit. Maybe we've not seen the enthusiasm we were seeing prior to the election. So, and perhaps it's not surprising against the background of everything that's happening, but just like to get your own take of where things are at the moment in terms of the thinking in the US and what's likely maybe to be the outcome of thinking.
Chris, can I use technology and ask George Ingram, who's listening to this online in Washington, to be prepared to come in with his perspective on that question as well?
By all means, we'd welcome that.
Hope he's still there.
Okay, there's a comment here.
Well, I couldn't support more the comments made by Lynn, and especially the one, the club among government agencies, where 4 months ago I was felt part of a club among government agencies. However, now being part of the NGO world, I'm still part of the same club. I feel it hasn't changed that much, and so I was thinking also the outcome of Liesbet's study, that do others need to join us, or do we need to join others? The example that struck me from the Middle East, for instance, where they have levels of coordination that I don't know who we is, but we, as we sit over here, I think a little bit, do we know of that? And aren't we trapped too much in our own ideology of, for instance, the Paris agenda? That is kind of sacred now, a Paris agenda, and aren't we trapped in that? And don't we need to think much more out of the box and looking for others than the usual suspects, and this usual suspect is a broad one already.
Thank you very much. Abby Riddell.
I'd like to start with, who can afford to take the risks? I'm very interested in this, how a global compact. We look at the UN, which has been delegitimized. I mean, I think of, the bombing in Kabul yesterday, for instance. Any one of us could have been in that, guest house. What is the legitimacy of any of the aid agencies, the NGOs? Jackie Kirk was killed last year. We've all been involved in this. How do we create a different compact so that it can enable us in whatever role, whatever hat we play? You, Ron, moving, I've moved, across many different agencies, so that we can come together in a way and take the risks within our agencies that bring about a compact between our agencies, between our governments and our NGOs, between our countries and the recipient countries that we're trying to do, between some of the very important principles that you've raised, Desmond, in terms of, yes, we're interested in results, but whose results, for whom, for what agenda? Because a lot of, the ideology, if you like, of the Paris Declaration has been very much an ideology. We pat ourselves on the back for joint assessments, 2 agencies doing something. Well, isn't that wonderful? But we're still doing independent evaluations and sending out our people to look at the evaluation of the Paris Declaration, which is saying that the countries themselves should be actually looking at us. How many countries, I mean, Uganda is one that did the PEEP evaluation of donors, in their country? How many of those are being, funded by the countries? The way in which we have to look at these things is really very radically different. And I think having the discussion that you're all, trying to foment, and that I am also trying to foment being part of the FTI midterm evaluation team, is terribly, important. But I hope that we can continue within the different agencies or different responsibilities or contracts as consultants that we take to look out of that box and to actually ask the provocative questions. We do know from those of us who have been, around as long as many of us in this room have been, that it's only if you're willing to stick your neck out of, your agency and actually ask those horrible questions that maybe your boss doesn't like to hear because it makes him look bad, which we are trying in the FTI evaluation to ask those questions, but we're getting slapped on the face. So may I just say, for those of you who are going to be in Rome next, week, please, let's stop being so defensive and really think about how our agencies can make the difference in the compact that we all are trying to achieve, rather than to look safe.
Thank you, Abby. Yes, over here.
I'm Janice Dolan with Save the Children. I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot, Desmond, and ask you, of the options that you presented, which of those options do you think will work best for fragile states?
Thank you.
Because I think that we would all agree that the international aid architecture, as it stands at the moment, is not very viable unless it can start addressing this issue of fragile states. The FTI has worked for a number of years to try to address this challenge, and there are particular challenges with aid modalities, how we get aid flowing, how we get commitments to these countries when a lot of donors don't have presence within those countries. And I think we've got to start thinking about how we can really address those challenges. And I think, just referring back to Catherine's question and Liesbet's study, I think if we had divided up the group of countries between low income and fragile states, we would have faced a different picture, because actually aid has flowed to some countries, the mechanisms have worked in those countries, and most of the 40 million children that have gained access to school live in low income countries that aren't facing issues of fragility and conflict.
Keith Lewin. Could I ask people to be brief now, please?
Thank you. Inputs and outputs. Isn't external assistance and development partner activity defined by inputs? Development partners don't deliver the outputs. But the sense in which this is very important is whether the outputs, which have been defined and are still being applied, are the outputs, the MDG-related ones, the EFA ones, which are still fit for purpose. And I think a lot of people feel that they aren't. And the problem is the outputs, or at least partly, because they are so narrowly defined and they don't reflect people's aspirations, or indeed a lot of the evidence on the contribution that education does make to development. But my point for the One Goal campaign is very simple. There is an input which is missing from this equation. It's a very important input. It's children who are of the right age, in the right grade, right learning environment. We have an accumulating base of evidence which tells us that in low enrollment countries, a third or more of the children are 2 or 3 years over age. Any child who's 3 years over age, particularly if they're a girl, will never complete a cycle of basic education. All high enrollment countries do not have age grade slippage. There's a simple message, a simple slogan. It's about being there, right time, right place.
Yes, over there. The person next to Olo.
Hello, my name is Rachel Lucia. I'm with ActionAid. I just want to thank the panelists for a really interesting discussion. What we've been doing at ActionAid, we've worked consistently on the aid effectiveness agenda, and we're now looking, in addition to that, at domestic resource mobilization more seriously. And I just wanted to raise the point here that though this discussion has been incredibly informative, how relevant is it, particularly in the education sector, since so much financing does come from domestic revenue, to not be looking at the interaction between aid and domestic revenue mobilization? And that can come in different ways. One is in terms of donor support through technical assistance upon request, for instance, to strengthening revenue authorities. But it can also come in terms of looking at what are the perverse incentives in aid-dependent countries in terms of financing and moving towards a sustainable financing of the education sector in the long term. It can also relate to what is the role of donor agencies to actually address the structural barriers to raising more resources, both at the national level and at the international level. So just something to keep in consideration.
Thank you. I think I can just take two brief points. Olav, you had your hand up. Can you be brief?
Yeah, thanks for a very interesting presentation, but what I'm sort of missing is the other side of the compact, the perspective of the poor countries and the real needs of the countries. The reason I'm saying is that we just had the general conference in UNESCO, where we had 70, 80 education ministers, vice ministers talking, and nobody, hardly any made any reference to FDI. But when we are on the donor circle, everybody refers to this to FDI. What the ministers from the south are concerned about now is the effect of the economic crisis, the fiscal space to invest in education, the teacher issue, the issue of linking to skills and economic development. So I'm really concerned how we can sort of try to link these two levels, and that's really any advice you could give to UNESCO in this would be much appreciated.
Thank you very much. You first and then second, but brief if you will.
Colin Bangay from DFID. Question to Desmond. You made a statement that if large countries like DRC knocked on the door of FDI, you don't think they would be able to FDI would be able to cope. And I suspect you're right, but I'd like to kind of unpack that. Do you think that's a result of the inability of FDI to attract sufficient funding to address the magnitude of the challenge, or an inability to broker a kind of in-country dialogue that's going to engage the domestic government and government funding and civil society? So what do you see as the fundamental challenge to that, and in your eyes, how would you actually solve that through a different modality, a different partnership, or a different compact?
Thank you, Colin. And the final question from
Francis from Plan International. Thanks to all the presentations, and after listening to Desmond, particularly actually the principles of aid compact that you presented, I was wondering whether it would be possible actually to transform FDI and make FDI apply those principles. And this is a question. But then actually further reflection, I was wondering whether there is any kind of actually arrogance among the donors and donor agencies beneath the philanthropic tendencies, right? And if it cannot be actually overcome, how can any aid architecture could be reformed, right? And coming to education in particular, I mean, the arrogance also cuts across. If you compare the total international aid and the GDP values of countries, developing countries, huge, and international aid is peanut, you know. And are we trying to actually make, by the small amount of money that we are giving to poor countries, want to expect quite a lot of wonders and miracles out of that? And is it fair? And I was also looking at, during an analysis, we were actually preparing a paper on how much governments are spending on education in the 46 countries we are working in, right? Huge. The ODA and the government's GDPs in these 46 countries, the countries' GDPs are 250 times bigger than the ODA that donors are giving. Looking at actually different countries, how come Cuba is having a very high level of education development index that receives very little aid? Is it merely actually the size of Cuba, or are there other reasons? Why can't actually such smaller countries in Africa achieve similar level of EPA? So it's not actually aid, ODA. Sometimes actually aid enthusiasts make that if there is no aid, no development. I think this is a kind of myth, and we have to actually become more and more aware of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There have been an enormous number of extremely important points made from the floor, and I don't think it's going to be easy to respond to them. I just want to add to, well, I don't want to add to it, but I want to say one thing about the architecture. I mean, it does seem to me that the first thing that has to happen in designing new architecture is to ask why is it that the existing architecture has not generated what was expected 10 or 15 years ago when these things were being discussed and then subsequently designed. And the fundamental thing for a global fund, a reform FTI or otherwise, is that there is an agreed and accepted mechanism for generating the resources to speak to the goals that are being sought. And so that essentially the way in which one should address, I think, the 4 points or indeed the 6 or 8 points that could be there on anybody's agenda is actually to say, okay, which of these will allow a mechanism which does deliver in those ways to be designed. Most of them would be consistent, I think, with the important principles that Desmond spelled out. You could design them in such a way that those principles were satisfied. But I think the mechanism is a real challenge. Anyway, over to you, and I'm going to allow both of you, if I may, 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll try. Just maybe to start with that last point, Chris, and then answer a couple of other comments from the floor in the same time. What has changed, even since we started work on this paper in January of this year, is a very significant shift in the global economic power balance away from the G8 to the G20. I don't think we should underestimate the importance of the statement in Pittsburgh that the G20 is now the major forum for debate on geopolitics and economic reform. And that's a recognition of the reality that the economic growth, that the budget deficits as opposed to surpluses as opposed to deficits, are now in the non-G8 countries rather than the G20. We need to take account of that, and I think we're just catching up with that and what that means to the international aid architecture. I think it has important implications in response to several people's comments from the floor. This dialogue would look very different if it was taking place in Beijing or Delhi or Pretoria, and it was chaired by those countries. And my guess is it would have much more of the substantive issues that Olaf mentioned were being discussed amongst the education ministers in UNESCO. I think we need to anticipate and encourage that that's what will happen. In my view, a global education compact should be chaired and led by a non-G8, G20 country rather than the US or the UK or any others, and have the UK and the US support that dialogue. That would change the dynamic of this conversation very significantly. Leading from there, I would say one of the things, and picking up Abby's point, and really I want to just say that all of the members of the FTI evaluation team deserve commendation and crash helmets, I think, for the difficult task they've taken on, but a very valuable task. And I encourage people to go to the website where a lot of the case study documents are already out there. They're fascinating reading. They're difficult reading for people like me that are involved in FTI, but they're fascinating and important. I think what's missing, in my view, is a real system for mutual accountability between donors and recipient countries. A real system which reports on a regular basis with evidence-based to say, you, recipient country or donor country, promised this, and this is what you've delivered. And we keep that going on an ongoing basis. In order for that to be real, it has to be, the entity that's reporting has to be independent of any one of those agencies. Otherwise, it has no credibility. You can't have, in my view, the World Bank reporting on that, because the World Bank is a major donor itself and therefore needs to be part of what's being held to account. And it has to have real and genuine ownership on all sides to say, yes, this is a credible report that we will hold ourselves accountable to. Janice, your question on which option would work best for fragile states. My own view is that it could be either number 2 or number 3 in my paper. It could be a transformed FTI that was genuinely independent. And genuinely independent is important in this case because whatever entity is there has to be able to choose the delivery channel that is best suited for purpose in that country. And in fragile states, in my view, the World Bank does not have a comparative advantage. And the experience of the Sudan Multi-Donor Trust Fund, I think, is showing that very clearly. So therefore, a genuinely independent entity would look at a country, would look at the existing entities that were there on the ground, civil society organizations of the country itself, and say, okay, we will channel our money through that and we'll hold that entity accountable for delivering results. But it needs to be free to be able to do that. So either number 2 or number 3, I think, would work best in those countries. That's not a view that's shared by everybody, as you know. And then the sort of question of just checking the phraseology of this question. Olav, your question about... Sorry, no, Colin, your question then about why is FTI in its current form not able to cope with large population countries? I think, crucially, it's a question of capacity within the FTI itself. You know, I headed a secretariat which had 15 people. I think it's grown slightly since then, but still. If DRC came knocking on the door, we would need to be able to have a very intense dialogue with the government and the local donor group of that country in order to give it the support it needed. And you'd be talking about very significant additional financing going into that country. Now, okay, the answer to that is always be, but FTI is about the local donor group. The local donor group in DRC has very limited capacity. So it's actually the debate on absorptive capacity, I think in many ways is the wrong one. It's disbursement capacity of funding agencies that is the critical bottleneck in my view. I always have in my mind an image of an hourglass where you've got huge money at the top, huge need at the bottom, and then frankly people like us who sit in that narrow bottleneck in the middle and stop the money going through because there's only so many countries we can be in. And somehow opening up that bottleneck and diversifying the flows of money, the ways that money can flow to a country, I think is key. So I think that, in my view, is the key constraint at the moment, is capacity. That's why the ambition, and I'm glad to hear Peter say that DFID is pushing for a greater ambition and a transformation of the FTI into something that can actually cope with the challenges of those particular countries. And UNESCO's role in all of this, Olav, I would say, would be to use its very powerful convening power to bring together a much more representative group of partners, including the countries and recipient countries, to discuss these issues.
Thank you very much, Desmond. And now to you, Lucia.
Well, I think only one of the remarks was addressed directly to me, and yes, I mean, I think it's a point well made. Interestingly, the summary of developing country demands is very much a kind of distillation of key themes emerging from the demands of the national coalitions that are members of the global campaign. And one of the things that we've seen coming increasingly to the fore is actually coalitions' desire to focus on a policy change agenda around early childhood care and development, which obviously to some extent feeds into the concern about the age at which children start school and their preparedness to participate and learn from that experience. So yes, I think it's an interesting point. I think I would just want to say a word or two just about what I think is a really interesting convergence going on here. I think there's a really interesting convergence between the opening up of thinking about a global aid architecture fit for purpose. And I'd agree with speakers who said that FTI provides a very good starting point, a very good set of groundwork, but that it isn't currently that global aid architecture fit for purpose, and that it does need a political effort at a higher and bolder level than probably than the current internal reform efforts. So I think it's quite interesting that that's converging with this big campaign effort going on in the outside world, which really is going to, if it is even a tenth of as successful as we hope it to be, is going to raise the question: what is the mechanism? What is the transmission belt for countries such as the US or such as a Germany wishing to, or one of the new donors wishing to increase aid to basic education in response to a campaign like this? It is going to put that on the agenda, and I think it is going to make us think really seriously about issues that have been raised here about inclusivity of governance. I think Olav's observation is absolutely emblematic of the state that FTI is in. It is not where developing country ministers are thinking. And it shouldn't be the whole of what they think, but it should be a part. So inclusivity of governance, which really does boost the developing countries' ownership and participation. Ambition in terms of the financing target, in terms of the countries it seeks to reach, including the fragile states and the high population countries, and accountability on both sides. And I think the lack of a clear accountability framework, which means that donors do fulfil the promises which have been made and made repeatedly, is one of the key challenges for the year ahead, and what we should all be looking to.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I mean, this is in fact a debate which is terribly important in the light of the political events that are taking place, and it's going to be an extremely important year. Many of these issues you will be very conscious of, I'm sure, in the press and in other fora. Thank you all for a very stimulating discussion. Thank you to our panelists for very good papers and for leading us off in those directions. Thank you all.
Thanks. I'm going to play this film.